I always used to think that leaving a place you call home for 10 years would feel like a slow, melancholic goodbye, maybe a little bit of nostalgia mixed with the dust of packing boxes. But the morning I finally loaded the last of my life into that U-Haul, it didn't feel like a funeral. It felt like a prison break, like I was finally taking my first real breath of oxygen after living underwater for a decade. And I was standing there on my driveway with a lukewarm cup of coffee, just watching the sunrise hit the trees, thinking I'd finally won, thinking the nightmare was over. But then I heard it, that rhythmic, sharp, aggressive click-clack of expensive heels hitting the pavement. And my stomach just dropped because I knew that sound. I knew that cadence. It was the sound of Janet, the self-appointed queen of the Oak Creek Estates Homeowners Association. A woman who treated a suburban cul-de-sac like it was a nuclear-armed sovereign nation, and she was the supreme leader. And she was marching toward me with a clipboard clutched to her chest like a shield of righteousness. Her face twisted into that familiar expression of disappointed authority that she usually reserved for people whose grass was half an inch too long or whose mailbox was the wrong shade of, eggshell, And she didn't even say hello. She just stopped 2 feet from me, adjusted her glasses, and snapped that I couldn't leave because I hadn't submitted my, departure authorization dossier, for board review. And I swear I almost choked on my coffee right then and there because I looked at her and said, Janet, I'm moving to a farmhouse 15 miles outside the city limits. I don't need your permission to exist in a different zip code, But she didn't even blink. She just tapped her clipboard and told me that until the board audited my property for, residual aesthetic damages, and approved my exit, I was still under her jurisdiction, and that was the exact moment I realized that moving wasn't oppos. Going to be the end of the story. It was just the opening bell for a war I never asked for, but one I was damn sure going to finish. See, to understand why Janet was so obsessed with me, you have to understand what Oak Creek used to be, because when my late wife, Sarah, and I first bought that house, it was beautiful. It was the dream. We wanted the white picket fence and the community potlucks and the sense of security that comes with a set of rules. And Sarah loved her garden more than anything. She'd spend hours out there with her roses. And back then, the HOA was just a group of neighbors looking out for each other. But after Sarah passed away a few years ago, the neighborhood started to change, or maybe I just started seeing it for what it really was, because Janet took over as president and suddenly, community, became, compliance, and every morning I'd wake up to a new yellow slip of paper taped to my door, sometimes for a stray weed in the driveway, sometimes because my trash cans were visible from the street for 10 minutes too long after the truck passed, and it felt like she was suffocating the memory of the life I'd built there. So I started saving every penny, working double shifts at the firm, just so I could buy 40 acres of raw land where the only neighbor I'd have to worry about was the occasional deer. And I'd spent months planning this escape, keeping it quiet, but Janet had spies everywhere, and she couldn't in oppos stand the idea of someone leaving her, kingdom, without her getting the last word, especially not the guy who had started voting against her, emergency beautification assessments, at every single board meeting. The day after she confronted me on the driveway, things went from petty to pathological because I woke up to an inbox flooded with, urgent compliance directives, from the HOA office. And when I say flooded, I mean 37 emails in 12 hours. They were charging me community depletion fee, of $800, moving truck weight surcharge, of $500. And they even had the audacity to fine me for, emotional disturbance of the peace, and, because apparently the sight of cardboard boxes on my porch was upsetting the neighbor's sense of tranquility, and I was sitting there in my half-empty living room, surrounded by memories of Sarah, feeling that old familiar heat rise in my chest, that feeling of being bullied in your own home, and I realized that Janet wasn't oppos. Just after money. She was trying to break me. She wanted me to crawl to her office and beg for mercy, so she could feel powerful one last time before I vanished. But she had no idea that my son, Leo, who just finished his academy training and was working his first rotation as a deputy sheriff in the next county over, had been coaching me on how to document every single interaction. And he told me, Dad, Don and Oppos. TL, Don and Oppos. T-fighter on our level. Just collect the paper trail and wait for her to trip over her own ego, end quote. And boy, did she trip. It started with the, end quote, traffic cones of justice, end quote, which is what I call them now, because on Tuesday morning, I went outside to find two bright orange cones blocking my own driveway with a sign that said, end quote, authorized HOA inspection zone, no entry, end quote. And there were two guys I'd never seen before, wearing reflective vests and holding measuring tapes, literally measuring the height of my porch steps. And I just stood there on the lawn, leaning against my truck, and asked them who they were. And one of them, this scrawny kid who looked like he'd rather be anywhere else, muttered that they were, end quote, independent contractors, end quote, hired by the board to verify, end quote, structural exit compliance, end quote. And I just laughed a long, tired laugh and told them that if they didn't oppose, move those cones in 60 seconds, I was going to call the actual police for trespassing. And they looked at each other, then looked at Janet's house across the street where I could see the curtains twitching, and they actually hurried away. But then the heavy artillery came out because an hour later, a tow truck pulled up a real, greasy-looking flatbed, and the driver started backing toward my Silverado, which was parked legally on my property. And he told me he had an order from the HOA for, end quote, unauthorized commercial adjacent vehicle storage, end quote. And I had to literally stand between the truck and the tow bar, phone in hand, filming the whole thing, until the driver realized I was, and oppose. Some pushover retiree and decided that $100 kickback from Janet wasn't oppose. Worth a lawsuit for auto theft. By Thursday, the pressure was constant. It was like psychological warfare. I had a private security SUV. No plates, just a magnetic, end quote, security, end quote, sign, circling my block every 20 minutes. The driver just staring at me with these cheap aviator sunglasses. And then the letter came, the one that changed everything. It was a formal, end quote, notice of intent to place lien, end quote. And it wasn't oppose. For my house in Oak Creek, which was already under contract to be sold. No, Janet's lawyers had sent a notice claiming they were going to place a lien on my new property, the farmhouse, claiming that because I was in, end quote, willful breach of community covenant, end quote, they had the right to pursue my assets outside the neighborhood to cover the, end quote, accrued damages, end quote, of my departure. And that was the moment my grief for Sarah and my frustration with the world fused into something cold and sharp. Because that land was my future. It was the last thing Sarah and I had dreamed of together. And Janet was trying to put her dirty, greedy hands on it. And I remember sitting there at midnight, the house quiet and echoing, looking at a photo of Sarah on the mantle and whispering, end quote, I oppose. I'm going to finish this, honey, I promise, end quote. And I spent the next 4 hours digging through the mountain of paperwork I collected, looking for the one thing I knew had to be there because Janet was many things. But she wasn't oppose. As smart as she thought she was. I went to the county records office the next morning, my eyes bloodshot from lack of sleep, but my head clearer than it had been in years. And I asked the clerk for the original plat maps for 1994, the ones filed when Oak Creek was first carved out of the old orchard lands. And then I asked for the, end quote, recent amendment filings, end quote, submitted by the HOA board over the last 3 years, and the clerk, this nice lady, named Mrs. Higgins, who had seen 1,000 petty neighborhood disputes, started frowning as she looked at the screen. She kept clicking and squinting, and finally she said, end quote, honey, this is strange, your lot 42, is listed in the 1994 filing as A and oppose, boundary adjacent exception and oppose. Because of the old creek line, it was never actually incorporated into the mandatory HOA zone. It was an optional membership, end quote. And then she pulled up the amendment Janet had filed 2 years ago, and her frown got deeper because on the new map, the red line of the HOA boundary had been, quite literally, drawn over with a digital pen to include my lot and the 3 acres of meadow behind it. But there was no record of a vote, no signature from the county surveyor, nothing. Janet had just faked it. She'd rewritten the geography of the neighborhood to make sure she could collect dues from me and keep me under her thumb. And as I walked out of that office with a certified, stamped copy of the original maps, I felt like I was holding a lightning bolt. I didn't oppose. Called Janet. I didn't oppose. Sent an angry email. I just went home and waited for the, end quote, emergency town hall, end quote. She'd call for Sunday night, an event she'd advertised as a, end quote, community standards briefing, end quote. But everyone knew it was a public execution for my reputation, and when I walked into that community center, the air was thick with that awkward, suburban tension. You know, the kind where everyone knows something bad is about to happen and they're half scared and half excited to watch the carnage. And Janet was up there on the stage behind a long table, looking like a high court judge, her board members sitting beside her like frightened bridesmaids, and she started in on this long, winding speech about, and quote, maintaining the sanctity of our shared vision, and quote, and how, and quote, certain individuals believe they are above the collective good, and quote. And she actually pointed at me in the front row and said I was, in quote, deserting the community with unpaid debts to the spirit of Oak Creek, end quote. And she looked so smug, so utterly convinced of her own invincibility, that for a second I almost felt sorry for her, but then I thought about Sarah's roses and the tow truck driver and the lien on my new land, and that pity evaporated into ice. I stood up, not waiting for her to give me the floor, and the room went dead silent. You could have heard a pin drop on that industrial carpet, and I didn't in oppos. TL, I just opened my binder and held up the certified map and said, and quote, Janet, I've spent 10 years paying you dues, 10 years following your rules, and 10 years watching you bully people who were too tired to fight back, but here's the thing about maps. They don't in oppos. TL, even when people do, end quote. And I walked up to the stage and laid that map down right in front of her, and I told the whole room, end quote, my house was never in the HOA, not in 1994, not now. Every fine you've issued, every lien you've threatened, every cent you've taken from me for an oppos, mandatory assessments and oppos, has been a theft, end quote. And you could see the color just drain out her face. It went from that fake tan orange to a ghostly, sickly gray, and she tried to stammer something about, end quote, clerical errors, end quote, and end quote, expanded jurisdiction, end quote. But then I pulled out the second paper, the transcript of her emails threatening my new property, and I said, end quote, this ISN and oppos. T just a mistake, Janet. This is racketeering. It and oppos. S fraud. And in an oppos. S harassment, end quote. And that's when the room exploded. Neighbors who had been silent for years started shouting, asking about their own lots, asking where the money was going. And Janet was banging her little gavel, screaming for order. But she'd lost the room. She'd lost the crown, and she knew it. But the real kicker, the part that felt like a movie script come to life, was when the double doors at the back of the hall swung open and Leo walked in. He was in full uniform because he'd just finished a shift, and he wasn't in oppos. T, there's my son. He was there as a representative of the law, and he had 2 other officers with him. And the look on Janet's face when she saw the handcuffs on his belt was something I will treasure until the day I die. Because Leo walked straight up to that stage, his voice calm and professional, and he said, end quote, Mrs. Miller, we've been reviewing the documentation provided regarding the fraudulent filing of county records and the multiple false police reports you filed over the last week, end quote. And Janet actually tried to run. She tried to duck behind the table like a kid playing hide and seek, but there was nowhere to go. And as Leo read her rights in front of the neighbors she'd spent a decade terrorizing, I realized that justice ISN and oppos. T. Always fast, but when it arrives, it's absolute. And she was led out of that hall in tears, her heels clicking one last time on the floor, but this time the sound didn't in oppos. T mean power, it meant, end quote, the end, end quote. The aftermath was like a fever breaking. The HOA board dissolved within 48 hours, 3 other members resigned in disgrace, and the county ended up appointing a receiver to audit the books, which, as it turns out, were a mess of, end quote, consulting fees, end quote, that went straight to Janet's brother's landscaping company, and the neighborhood actually felt like a neighborhood again. People were out on their lawns talking, laughing, not looking over their shoulders for a clipboard-wielding tyrant. And when I finally drove that U-Haul out of Oak Creek for the last time, 3 of my neighbors, people I hadn't in oppos, spoken to in years because we were all too scared of being seen as, in quote, uncooperative, end quote, actually stood at the end of their driveways and waved. And one of them, old Mr. Henderson, who'd lived there since the beginning, walked up to my window and handed me a small, potted rosebush and said, end quote, for the new place, give Sarah our best, end quote. And I had to pull over a mile down the road just to compose myself because for the first time since she died, it felt like the weight was gone, like the world was wide. and open in mine again. Now, I'm sitting here on the porch of my farmhouse, looking out over 40 acres of wild grass and ancient oak trees. The only sound is the wind in the leaves and the occasional hawk circling overhead. And there are no rules here about what color my front door has to be or where I park my truck. I got Sarah's roses planted in a big circle by the fence, and they're blooming like they know they're finally free. And I sometimes think about Janet, sitting in her small apartment while she waits for her trial, wondering if she ever realized that power is a hollow thing when it's built on fear, or if she still thinks she was the hero of her own story, trying to save a world that never wanted her help in the first place. But then a neighbor from 3 miles down the road pulls up in a dusty old Jeep, not to check my grass height, but to ask if I need a hand fixing the old barn roof. And I realize that this is what community actually looks like. It's not a contract, it's a choice. But, looking back on it all, it makes me wonder about the hundreds of other Oak Creeks out there, the thousands of people who are currently living under the thumb of some local dictator because they think they have to, because they've been told that, in quote, order in quote, is more important than, in quote, liberty, in quote. And I wonder if it's ever really about the property values at all, or if it's just about the human urge to control something, anything, when the rest of life feels out of reach. And I've got to ask you, if you were in my shoes, if you found out your entire, in quote, community, in quote, was built on a lie, would you have stayed and fought to change the system, or would you have just walked away and never looked back? Because sometimes I think the only way to truly win against a person like Janet is to show them that their world is much, much smaller than they ever imagined, and that the fences we build to keep people in are the same ones that eventually leave us standing all alone in a kingdom of dirt. So what do you think? Is an HOA ever really worth the peace of mind they promise? Or are they just a ticking time bomb for people with too much time and a little bit of power? Drop a comment below and let me know your worst neighbor stories, because after everything I've been through, I think I've heard it all, but something tells me the world is full of Janets just waiting for someone to finally stand up and say, in quote, no, end quote.